During the PS2 generation, EA produced some excellent Bond games. They started the generation out with Agent Under Fire. This was a short and sweet experience with great arena multiplayer. This was followed up by Nightfire, which improved on some areas from the prior game and delivered a great campaign with good multiplayer. Everything or Nothing provided the ultimate Bond experience with its wealth of variety. From Russia with Love was a tribute to the classic and first era of Bond, and Sean Connery even returned to reprise his role. EA could honestly do no wrong when it came to James Bond during this generation. Sadly, their last Bond game was going to end their time with the license on a sour note. EA planned on having the same developer who made Medal of Honor Frontline to tackle a new Bond-like experience. This new game would put the player in the role of a villain, along with the gameplay focusing on first-person shooting. The concept was interesting, and the developer had a history of making great first-person shooters. Sadly, the execution ended up being one of the worst Bond games in the series. Join me as we take a look back at Goldeneye Rogue Agent. During the PS2 generation, EA Los Angeles was focused on providing quality titles within their Medal of Honor series. Both the developer and EA saw success from Medal of Honor Frontline. At the same time, EA had other studios working on different entries within the James Bond franchise. EA Los Angeles was then provided the opportunity to make an original first-person shooter set within the Bond universe. The goal was to create the spiritual successor to the N64 classic Goldeneye. This would be known as Goldeneye Rogue Agent. The developers opted to focus on putting the player into the shoes of an original character. Essentially, the players would take on the role of a villain rather than controlling James Bond. This character's name would be known as Goldeneye and would be an agent of MI6 who was thrown out for brutal tactics. From a story perspective, the writers wanted to dive into the darker side of the Bond universe and focus on the villains. The story would feature villains like Goldfinger and Dr. No. The gunplay was going to focus on dual wielding, and the player could only use what they currently were holding. This meant that the player would need to figure out which weapons they wanted for each of the fights. The developers wanted to use this as a way for the players to mix and match which weapons they were holding for combat. Prior Bond games had elements of stealth incorporated into the levels, but with Rogue Agent, the stealth was going to be dropped for a more intense and high action experience. With the player assuming the role of a villain, this was going to be integrated in some of the gameplay. For example, the player could take enemies as human shields, a move that would feel appropriate for this new character and one that would not fit with James Bond. Gadgets were going to be available to the player, but not in the traditional sense. The main character was going to have a golden eye that would provide the player with different options like disarming enemy weapons. In addition, one of the developers who had a hand in the AI for Halo 1 was brought on to develop the enemy AI for this game. The goal was to have the AI behavior that was not scripted, but rather adaptive to the player's inputs. The developers were looking to create an original experience that focused on telling a story about the villains of Bond, rather than Bond himself. The concept sounded interesting and a promising one for a video game. In November 2004, Goldeneye Rogue Agent was released to the world. Goldeneye Rogue Agent is a first-person shooter that does not provide much in the form of variety. From its gameplay, this is a more focused experience. There are no gadgets to use nor vehicle levels to help break up the action. While having the gameplay be much smaller in scope and focused, this could be a good experience with good execution, but sadly that isn't the case here. Some of the action can provide you with some fun, but there are a lot of flaws that either make the action feel tedious or frustrating. And while the story sounds like a piece of fanfiction, the execution of the narrative sadly matches the quality or lack of quality in the gameplay. All of the action is focused on the first-person shooting. There are some unique mechanics at play here. You can dual-wield almost any combination of weapons within the game. You can have a pistol with a shotgun or an SMG. You can only hold on to what you have on hand, so this creates an experience where you really need to consider what weapons you want to have equipped for the next set of firefights. Some weapons cannot be wielded like this, like the rocket launcher or assault rifle. The ammo count is rather low, and in concept this creates situations where you need to continually change up what you are using within a firefight. I noticed that it was best to have two different weapons equipped so that you were using two different weapons and not taking all of your ammo from the same ammo pool. You get the standard issue of expected weapons as well, along with some cool ones. You get a remote mine launcher, and this will stick an explosive onto an enemy and then you can detonate it. The basic pieces are all in place to have a fun shooting experience, but the actual shooting gameplay has a lot of issues that don't make it enjoyable. The big one you will notice right away is how the shooting lacks any sort of weight to it. There's a general lack of impact to your hits. The okay sound effects and some fun animations like how enemies will flip backwards if you headshot them are pretty cool, but firing the weapons feels like you are firing toys rather than firearms. The shots mostly land with little impact, there's a lack of feedback while firing, and then the sound effects could be a lot better. The shooting needs more punch to it. A good example of this is with the minigun. It kills enemies quick, but it lacks the impact to make those deaths satisfying. When it comes to the handling and aiming, this also feels off and not as tight as the prior first-person shooter Bond games. This created an experience where I felt imprecise because of how the game was designed. What also contributes to this is the awkward position of the crosshair. In Rogue Agent, it is placed a bit higher than the dead center of the screen. This makes the entire game feel off, so much so I thought there was something wrong with my game. I noticed this right away, and it makes the shooting very jarring with where the crosshair is. I also found this kind of funny with how such a small adjustment can throw me off. To the game's credit, I do like what they were trying to go for with the weapons. Like how you never really had an inventory of guns that you could switch to on the fly, but rather you needed to figure out what you need to have equipped and grab from the ground during fights. But the shooting has way too many flaws to really make it satisfying, and as you keep playing, you will feel how lackluster this game is. Rogue Agent does try to implement some other features within this game to give some variety to the shooting. You can soften up enemies with a melee hit and use them as a human shield. This is pretty fun and provides you with another option for some additional protection, but you won't be using it that much throughout the campaign. Then you have the powers from your Goldeneye. This eye has an energy system that allows you to do different moves. You can look through walls, hack guns to disarm them, create a shield, and then throw enemies with a magnetic field. Some of the powers are really fun to use, but the game does not really allow you to experiment and play with these powers. The energy regenerates slowly, which results in you not using the powers that often and mostly saving the energy for the shield. I think if the game had a different sort of energy and combat flow, this would create a more enjoyable gameplay experience. A potential suggestion would be if there was a way to earn some energy back from killing enemies. This would encourage you to use your powers more, but also try to use them efficiently to clear the rooms. If this was mixed with better shooting and smoother movement, this could have created something compelling from the gameplay. For the most part, the powers feel tacked on. A big missed opportunity are the lack of interesting levels and situations for the player. The Bond games have had excellent first-person shooters before, with GoldenEye, Agent Under Fire, Nightfire, and all three of these games had either interesting objectives, exploration, and different situations to change up the flow of the combat. Some would even feature stealth, going up against snipers, using gadgets to complete objectives, but Rogue Agent is mostly a set of extended shootouts, and that's about it for most of the levels. Again, this would be fine if the minute-to-minute shooting was actually good, but that isn't the case here. Rogue Agent's levels are a big missed opportunity to include situations that keeps the player guessing. The levels here are rather bland and not that interesting. To give the game credit, there are some fun situations of being able to use traps to easily kill some enemies, but this stuff is more on rails than really being something that is discovered by the player. What also hurts the levels are the bad checkpoints within the game, and towards the end you will be repeating areas areas over and over again, along with some instant kill enemies. Considering the game was using the Goldeneye name, this would have been a good opportunity to have at least one vehicle level dedicated to a tank to really give a nod to the original. But sadly, no vehicle sequences are provided here. Rogue Agent was billed as a game that took place in an alternate universe and focused on the more evil side of Bond, but the game doesn't really do anything with its gameplay to show this. The concept is interesting, but the talent comes from the execution, and from a gameplay standpoint, this game is lackluster and a huge missed opportunity.
Goldfinger is pleased with your performance on the mountains. He asked me to arrange for another upgrade. The magnetic hack feature will allow you to tamper with machines and electronics from a distance. The effects vary depending upon the target. A burst from the hack upgrade can cause an enemy's weapon to malfunction. It's also an effective means of manipulating and reprogramming electronic equipment via remote control. This is the first field trial of the EM hack upgrade. I look forward to reviewing the results.
The story of Rogue Agent is about an agent named Goldeneye who gets kicked out of MI6 and then joins forces with Goldfinger, who is at war with Dr. No. This sounds like a silly fanfiction story that would make for a fun video game, but just like with the gameplay, the execution is not that good. If you have watched any of my videos before, I can enjoy some really dumb things if there's some charm in that execution. This game features the main character whose name is Goldeneye, and he actually has a golden eye that gives him powers. This is really stupid, but if presented differently, this could actually work. I feel like if the game leaned away from being very serious and went for more of a Roger Moore-like tone, this would have worked even better. Then again, this would require the writers to be able to deliver on something like that. Rogue Agent uses the Goldeneye name as a means to lure people into the game, and really does nothing to respect the original game or film. The conflict between Goldfinger and Dr. No is not developed and needed more details to really build up that conflict. Different characters are thrown into the story with little reason, and this makes the entire thing feel like a giant mess or like a bad piece of fanfiction. And there's more missed opportunities here. You get kicked out of MI6 for being a loose cannon, but this isn't presented well to the player and feels forced. I wish this was elaborated on, and this could have been a good foil to James Bond. Bond is used in the game during the training sequence where he dies like a chump. If you are going to make a game in the Bond universe where you are the bad guy, it would have been cool to have James Bond trying to stop you. The best parts from the story are the cutscenes where Scaramanga tells you about your new upgrades, and he is voiced by Christopher Lee. Outside of this, the story is not interesting, it's underdeveloped, lackluster, and not fun at all. Not even the multiplayer could save this game. The prior EA Bond first-person shooters had optional bots preserving the multiplayer, but here there are no bots in this game. I am kind of shocked that this game was made by the same studio who provided us with some excellent Medal of Honor games. This honestly feels like a studio's first attempt at a first-person shooter and lacks the understanding on what makes this genre good. This is easily one of the worst EA Bond games. Goldeneye Rogue Agent is a bad game, and a bit disrespectful to the original Goldeneye. The PS2 generation was full of great Bond titles, starting with Agent Under Fire all the way through From Russia with Love. EA published all of these games, and they provided excellent experiences from first-person shooters to third-person action games. For me, this was the golden era of Bond games. Rogue Agent did sound like fanfiction from its concept, but with the right execution, this could have worked out really well. What was surprising is how Rogue Agent was made by the same team that made Medal of Honor Frontline, along with other quality titles in that series, and none of that talent and quality carried over into this particular game. Rogue Agent's gameplay is imprecise, feels weightless, lacks quality impact and feedback. The levels and objectives are very boring, and the story is a giant mess that does not respect the prior Goldeneye game or film. In many ways, this game feels like a cash grab to cash in on the Bond license and the Goldeneye name. Another big missed opportunity was how the developers wanted to focus on playing as the bad guy in a Bond film, but this was not conveyed to the player at all through the gameplay. The developers were aiming to make a run-and-gun style shooter, and they cited that this was in the style of the original Goldeneye. But for anyone who has played the original, they would know that isn't really what the original game was about. The original did have linear high-action levels, but there were plenty of levels that allowed for exploration and fun mini sandbox experiences that provided a lot of replay. Along with this, there was a lot of problem-solving and player discovery throughout completing many of the objectives. Many of these core elements from the original Goldeneye were absent in Rogue Agent. This leads me to believe that the developers were a bit misguided in how they remembered or saw the original game for their new one. This is a real sour note to end on for EA, as this was the last Bond game that they made. The PS2 generation has some of the finest Bond games, but Rogue Agent is not one of them. I would recommend you skip this title, and thank you very much for watching. If you are interested in being notified of new videos, please hit the subscribe button and bell. And if you would like to help support the channel and get early access to content, please check out my Patreon. All of the links will be at the end of this video and within the description. And thank you very much for watching.